Committee will come to order, and good afternoon. Sorry for the delay to our witnesses. We did have a series of votes, and both Ms. Baz and I were delayed, so I apologize for that. It has been, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, a very bad year in Vietnam for human rights. Since the beginning of 2018 alone, the Vietnamese government has handed out sentencing totaling over 100 years in prison and house arrest to human rights defenders and democracy advocates. In the past year alone, 22 bloggers have been jailed, as well as 6 members of the Brotherhood for Democracy. An outrageous 15-year sentence was given to Nguyen Van Dai, whose wife, Vu Minh Khan, testified before this committee back in 2016. I would note parenthetically, we're hoping for his release. I would note parenthetically that I met with Nguyen Van Dai. Matter of fact, Dr. Tong helped to arrange it in Hanoi in the year 2005. And virtually everyone except one other person, he was a lawyer representing a number of people on human rights cases, were all detained by police and couldn't come and meet in his Hanoi law office. It was really very, very discouraging. And also an insight into how repressive the communist government regime is in Vietnam. I would note that Scott Flipsy, who has done yeoman's work for years, who is right behind me here, met with Nguyen Van Dai in Hanoi in 2007 and 2009 while he was in prison. So we've had a long-standing concern and that we've expressed over and over again for him and for the others have been held unjustly by the Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese government has gotten their free pass on human rights for far too long. There are currently at least 169 political and religious prisoners in Vietnam, including bloggers, labor union activists and democracy advocates, and religious leaders. Freedom House rates Vietnam as not free and possessing of some of the world's highest press and internet restrictions. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, again this year, recommended that Vietnam be designated as a country of particular concern for egregious religious freedom abuses. I would note that I am disappointed when the new list came out, and I did personally lobby the administration. We didn't get any luck with the last administration or with the Bush administration, which took it off CPC category, and so far not yet with the new Trump administration. U.S. policy has failed the Vietnamese people. This is a bipartisan criticism. We have enriched Vietnam's communist leaders and coddled their interests at the expense of the hopes and desires of the Vietnamese people of liberty and human rights, which they are striving to achieve, but have been, unfortunately, repressed. The Trump administration does have an opportunity to bring about real reforms in Vietnam if and only if human rights improvements are linked to better U.S.-Vietnamese relations. The U.S. has leverage to encourage reform. Vietnam needs a strong U.S. partnership, particularly as China's aggressiveness increases. The question is, will there be leverage, and will this leverage be used to help the people of Vietnam, or will our acquiescence or indifference be used to help the communist leaders? I have been to Vietnam a number of times on human rights trips. I've met with its rights advocates, young activists for decades. The younger generation in Vietnam, 66% of Vietnam is under the age of 40, looks to the U.S. as a land of opportunity and a land of freedom. This generation wants the same liberties enjoyed by their relatives living in California, Texas, Virginia, Louisiana, and in my home state of New Jersey, and so many other places where former Vietnamese refugees have flourished. They want to speak freely, blog freely, worship God freely, and be free to choose and change their leaders. Failing to press for concrete human rights improvements underestimates U.S. leverage and will disappoint the young generation of Vietnam, who are that country's dynamic future. The president will face pressure from his advisors and the business community, especially the business community, to look at Vietnam through the lens of trade deals and containment of China. Hopefully he will be able to see the situation more clearly than past administrations, and that's a bipartisan criticism. Both Republicans and Democrats in the White House have not done what they could have done to make a difference. No government that represses its own people or restricts fundamental freedoms can be a trusted ally of the United States. No government that censors the internet, tortures, and jails dissidents, crushes civil society, should be given generous trade and security benefits without conditionality. Robust championing of individual rights will meet with some success if recent history is our guide. The Vietnamese government has responded to concerns expressed by the last two administrations when they linked human rights improvements to better U.S.-Vietnamese relations. Whether to gain entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, or to address U.S. concerns over religious freedom, the Vietnamese government took steps when we insisted and when they were pressed by American presidents. It is when the U.S. loses interest in human rights that conditions regress, as it has in the past year. The business of the Communist Party is staying in power and repressing those that believe will challenge their power, that they believe will challenge their power. They will not embrace human rights improvements or the rule of law unless it's a firm condition of better relations with the U.S. Putting human rights and the rule of law at the center of bilateral relations is the goal of H.R. 5621, the Vietnam Human Rights Act, bipartisan legislation that I introduced last month. I would note parenthetically that that bill, different iterations of it, but with a lot of input, including from some of our witnesses, including Dr. Tong, has passed the House 4 times. It always gets over to the Senate, and holds are placed on it, and those holds are to the detriment of the Vietnamese people. Hopefully this year we'll see a change. The bill emphasizes the connection between human rights improvements and U.S. interests, and states that U.S. policy should prioritize the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, internet freedom, independent labor unions, which are non-existent, the protection of women and girls from trafficking, and advances in the rule of law as critical components of both U.S.-Vietnamese relations and any U.S.-led effort to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific region. I mentioned the bill had passed 4 times, 3 times as a freestanding bill, once as an amendment. And even then, when Frank Wolf was willing to get it into an appropriations bill, a senator, 2 to be exact, stepped in and objected, and out it came. So it's time for that to end. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any comments you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing and bringing attention to the myriad of human rights violations in Vietnam. Just over 1 year ago, we had an important hearing on how religious freedom and human rights in Vietnam are critical to the U.S. national interest. Starting from the restoration of diplomatic relations with Vietnam in '95, the bilateral relationship with the United States has grown considerably, especially in trade and investment. Over the past decade, U.S. exports to Vietnam have increased over 9-fold, from $10 billion in 2016. U.S. imports in 2016 were $10 billion, up 43% from 2015, and 823% over the past decade. The relationship between our two nations is animated by the increase of Vietnamese who have immigrated to the United States. Over 1.3 million immigrants call the U.S. home. The deepening of this relationship, however, is going to depend on how much progress the government of Vietnam makes on critical human rights, namely free press and political dissent, land expropriation, religious freedom, workers' rights, and human trafficking. Unfortunately, the trend lines are not positive. CNN reported that 6 human rights activists in Vietnam have been sentenced to between 7 and 15 years in jail. As was mentioned by the chairman, the Hanoi People's Court has given the longest sentence to human rights lawyer Nguyen Van Dai for trying to overthrow the People's Administration. The judgment comes amid a wider crackdown on peaceful dissent that has seen several bloggers and human rights activists given long jail sentences in the last 12 months. During 2017, authorities arrested at least 21 bloggers and activists for exercising their civil and political rights. They were arrested for national security offenses, but in reality, the offenses included writing articles critiquing the government, critical of the government, and peaceful activism. Added to this, Vietnam's legislature is set to pass a cybersecurity law that would provide the government another means by which to silence and punish those critical of the government. This is a deeply disturbing trend and one that the government of Vietnam needs to halt and reverse. I look forward to hearing the views, perspectives, and recommendations, and I want to thank the chairman for allowing 2 of our colleagues, Zoe Lofgren and Alan Lowenthal, to participate in this hearing.
Thank you. Let the yield to Chairman Rohrabacher.
Well, I was not prepared to have an opening statement, but I will just speak from the heart, which is what makes us all Americans is that we believe in freedom. That's what it's supposed to do. There are no greater champions of freedom that I know than Vietnamese Americans who have suffered tyranny and suffered under what now is not even a communist government, but a crony capitalist government that is totally oppressive of its people. And in that, there's very little difference between that and what the communists believed, except the communists were sincere. The gang that now, because they thought they're going to change the world by oppressing everybody and eliminating religion, getting rid of democratic notions. The group that now controls Vietnam is a group of gangsters that have their clique, and they are oppressing anyone who might get in their way. And one thing I would like to ask the panel of, and I know, now, Mr. Chairman, as you know, I opposed the Magnitsky Act. Only the title, however, I supported and support the idea of holding accountable those people who are committing human rights violations, those individuals and those specific offices overseas. I don't think the Magnitsky was the proper name, because I think that particular case is still decided as to what happened. But the idea of punishing specific individuals overseas for their human rights violations is a good idea, and I call on you, Mr. Chairman, and the rest of my members here, let's find out who specifically in Vietnam are conducting these human rights abuses and hold them specifically accountable. And I pledge my support to the Vietnamese community in achieving that goal. Thank you very much, and thanks for holding this a very important hearing.
I just point out to my friend, and I'll go to my Ms. Zoe Lofgren, in our new bill, as I think the gentleman knows, we do have a strong admonishment to the administration to use the Magnitsky Act and also use the tools that are in the International Religious Freedom Act, which I sponsored, became law. We named it after Frank Wolf, the great champion of religious freedom. But there's brand new tools that Brownback, of course, the president has now. Brownback is the ambassador at large for religious freedom, can really bring to bear on Vietnam. I do think we missed an opportunity when we did not, the U.S. government, did not designate Vietnam as CPC country. But that could be done at any time. It doesn't have to be done annually. It can be done any time, and I think the record absolutely invites that because they have a horrific record on religious persecution. I'd like to yield to Zoe Lofgren.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bass. I want to thank Chairman Smith and Representative Lowenthal and I co-chair the Vietnam Caucus, and although this is an official Foreign Affairs Committee, it's very gracious of you to allow us to participate, and I appreciate it very much. This is an important topic, how the government in Vietnam is using Article 79 to oppress people and to suppress free speech. Some of the tools that we might have that have not yet been utilized in the Human Rights Act that we have passed repeatedly, the Magnitsky Act that has been mentioned. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and so we can get to them sooner. I would just like to ask unanimous consent to put my remarks in the record.
Without objection, so ordered, and thank you. I'd like to yield to Mr. Garrett. No?
I would yield back my time.
Mr. Lowenthal, gentleman from California.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for all attending, and I thank also the chairman, Chairman Smith, for inviting me to participate, and I appreciate that, and also Ranking Member Bass. I appreciate that. As one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Vietnam Caucus, I've advocated in Congress on the issue of human rights abuses in Vietnam. During my time in Congress, I have adopted several Vietnamese prisoners of conscience who were unfairly and unjustly jailed for their political and religious beliefs. Two of my prisoners of conscience, Pastor Win Kong Chin and Win Tien Trung, have been released. I want to thank BPSOS for their work in helping to relocate the Pastor Win Kong Chin, to the United States. Unfortunately, this is not the fate of the many of the others who've been imprisoned for their act. I want to highlight, as has been pointed out, the case of Win Van Dai, a pro-democracy activist, co-founder of the Brotherhood for Democracy, Mr. Wynn is one of my current prisoners of conscience. He's a human rights lawyer, a blogger who was recently sentenced unjustly to 15 years in prison. For what? For speaking out against human rights abuses. He traveled throughout Vietnam to teach law students and to train young human rights defenders on human rights reporting mechanisms, how to deal with police interrogation, and then he was tried for conducting propaganda against the state. He was sentenced to prison and forced to close his office. You know, through the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I've advocated for the release of Mr. Wynn. I want to also acknowledge Mr. Anthony Lee, who is here today. He's a spokesperson for the Brotherhood for Democracy, and I look forward to hearing from his testimony. Again, I just want to, in concluding, I want to highlight another prisoner of conscience of mine, the most venerable Thich Quang Do, the Supreme Patriarch of the United Buddhist Church of Vietnam. The Patriarch has been jailed numerous times for leading nonviolent protests against the Vietnamese government and for calling for religious freedom. He is currently under house arrest. It is unconscionable that the Venerable, the Supreme Patriarch is kept in jail, or at least under house arrest now. And then I want to thank, and I'll just end, Chairman Smith and the other co-chairs of the Vietnam Caucus for Chairman Smith's work on H.R. 5621. I'm glad to participate in that and to help. It imposes, among other things, it would invoke sanctions per the Magnitsky Act. It would impose financial and travel restrictions for human rights abusers, and it calls for the release of religious and political prisoners and designates Vietnam as a country of particular concern. I look forward to the testimonies, and again, I thank the chair for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Garrett?
Thank you. Thank you, and reclaiming my time. I just felt like saying that. I want to speak briefly because I know that sometimes in this body it's frustrating. We don't feel like we're getting things done, but I do know that people in the Republic of Vietnam watch these hearings. And so I want to take this opportunity in front of this assembled group, as well as these distinguished guests, to speak to my vision as it relates to our interaction with the nation of Vietnam. I had the honor with the ACYPL prior to my entry into this august body to visit Vietnam, and what I watched was a dynamic emerging economy with opportunity and all sorts of good leading indicators for the future. However, the good facts as it relates to Vietnam, as well as their geographical location adjacent to China, who seems more and more bent on hegemonic behavior within the region, and the emerging economy will not aid in relations with the United States, despite the fact that we want to encourage those who would stand against that hegemonic behavior by China, those who would engage in good international economic relations, and those economies that are vibrant and emerging to do so, so long as human rights violations persist. And I stress that point, and that is the only reason that I reclaim time, so that those in Vietnam who are watching this understand that the people in this body on both sides of the aisle appreciate the tools that are at our disposal. I don't know what took us so long to get global Magnitsky, but I think now that we have it, we need to be willing to use it. That we should engage in trade relations with nations who honor basic human dignities and rights, which include the freedom of expression, the freedom to love who you wish, worship how you want, or behave how you will, so long as you do not harm another. And these things aren't occurring in Vietnam. So in essence, Mr. Chairman, as long as Vietnam recognizes basic fundamental human rights, it's exciting to think about the prospects going forward in the relations between our nations, particularly in light of the history between our two nations. But so long as they stymie the basic expression of individuals and disallow individuals from seeking their own conscience, soul, and self-determination as it relates to their beliefs, then this will stymie this relationship. And let that, if I have any contribution to this body today, be the message that I send. We want to work with you. We want to trade with you. We want to be friends with you. But if we are who we aspire to be as a nation, we will not until you recognize basic human liberties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garrett. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panel, beginning from my left, your right. What a high honor and a privilege to welcome back Ein Joseph Cao, the first Vietnamese American to be elected to the United States Congress, representing the 2nd Congressional District of Louisiana. At the age of 8, Ein Joseph Cao was placed by his mother onto a U.S.-bound plane, fleeing Saigon with his 4-year-old brother and 14-year-old sister. His mother stayed behind to raise 5 children, while her husband spent 7 years in re-education camps where he was tortured repeatedly. In the United States, Ein was separated from his siblings and raised by an uncle. Later, he moved to Falls Church, Virginia, where he volunteered with Boat People SOS, working to protect the last boat people stranded in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, and to secure the resettlement of re-education camp survivors. In the fall of 1997, Ein returned to New Orleans to attend law school and join the board of directors of Boat People SOS there. We appreciate his service here in Congress. He was an absolute leader on human rights in general, but especially for Vietnamese, and thank him for the insights that he has provided years to date, and I know will again today. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Nguyen Dinh Thanh. Dr. Thanh left Vietnam with his family as a boat person in 1978 and arrived in the United States in 1979 after 7 months in a refugee camp in Malaysia. He graduated with a PhD in mechanical engineering in 1986 and worked for 15 years at a research lab of the United States Navy. For the past 35 years, he has been involved in community services, refugee protection, and human rights advocacy in the United States and in Asia. Under his leadership, Boat People SOS has grown into an international organization with operations in 14 locations in the U.S. and in Asia. In 2008, he co-founded the Coalition to Abolish Modern-Day Slavery in Asia, called CAMSA, which has so far rescued and or assisted over 5,000 victims of labor and sex trafficking. He travels extensively to Asia and closely monitors the human rights conditions of Vietnam. And I would just note parenthetically before going on to our other very distinguished witness, Dr. Thanh, when the comprehensive plan of action was being closed with about 40,000 stranded refugees in Southeast Asia, we had very credible insights and information that many of the people who were true refugees had been improperly screened out, and this was by the Clinton administration. I held 5 hearings. Dr. Thanh provided insight at those hearings that pointed out, and it became something that we really acted upon, that many people were intimidated. If they got anything wrong with their interview, which were very, very hostile, they weren't U.S. adjudicators, they were people from Hong Kong and elsewhere who didn't want them there. And I remember going to High Island in Hong Kong and seeing refugees there and being told, how hostile it was. We had one man who was a double amputee who said, I have a target on my back if I go back. I fought in the war, and they're trying to forcibly repatriate me, and they're calling it voluntary repat or repatriation. So from those hearings, Dr. Thanh and Joseph Reese, who was then our chief of staff, and I worked on an amendment that led to the Rover program, and over 20,000 Vietnamese people were actually given asylum here as a direct result of that program. That would not have happened without Dr. Thanh, and I want to thank him for that. I remember offering the amendment on the floor, and it passed against all odds. It wasn't supposed to pass. And one of the things that they told us, and this is part of the disinformation campaign that some even well-meaning people do, they told us that anybody who was going back would have a repatriation monitor. So I had a hearing on repatriation monitors. Turns out there were 7 of them. And what did those 7 do? Well, they would go back and talk to someone who was forcibly repatriated. Right next to him would be somebody from the secret police. Who in their right mind is going to say, I'm being discriminated against or hurt or in any way maltreated with that person sitting there? So when the repatriation monitor exits the town or hamlet, whatever it might be, or a village, they're left to deal with those consequences. It was a farce. We used that in our debate, and thankfully we got the Rover program out of it. Then I would like to welcome now Adina Pokempner, who is General Counsel for Human Rights Watch. Her work has taken her to Cambodia, the Republic of Korea, Vietnam, former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere in documenting and analyzing compliance with international humanitarian law. war crimes and violations of civil and political rights. She has written on freedom of expression, peacekeeping operations, international tribunals, UN human rights mechanisms, cyber liberties and security, and refugee law, among other human rights topics, and oversees the organization's positions on international law and policy. A graduate of Yale and Columbia University School of Law and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Ms. Poe-Kempner also teaches at Columbia University, and we welcome her and are grateful that she's here today to testify. We will then hear from Anthony Lee, who is here today as spokesman for the Brotherhood for Democracy. He has participated in the struggle for the basic civil rights of the Vietnamese workers, farmers, and fishermen under the communist regime. He and other assigned members have organized regular workshops for workers about their rights and advocacy skills for their rights and interests, in addition to equipping them with the knowledge about organizing independent labor unions that currently do not exist, as I said earlier, in Vietnam. We deeply appreciate his presence here today, and I also would like to welcome Angela Huyn, who will be acting as his translator today. Congressman Gao, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. First of all, I would like to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass for holding this important hearing today concerning Vietnam's human rights abuses this past year. Indeed, it was a bad year for human rights in Vietnam. Fortunately, the Vietnamese American community has Chairman Smith and members of this subcommittee who have been champions for human rights in Vietnam and around the world for as long as I can remember. As Chairman Smith stated, my first encounter with him came in 1996. I first met Chris Smith as an intern of Boat People SOS to advocate for the rights of Vietnamese refugees. He listened attentively to an unknown 29 years old Vietnamese American who had little experience lobbying for human rights on Capitol Hill. I returned to Washington, D.C. 13 years later as a member of Congress, and there was Chris Smith, serving as my colleague and guide on the legislative process to bring about changes to the human rights conditions in Vietnam. Today, I appear before the subcommittee as a former member of Congress, and here is Chris Smith, still listening with the same attentiveness and determination to make this world a better place. Thus, my relationship with Chairman Smith spans over 2 decades, and with the help and sometimes even the lead of other human rights advocates such as Dr. Thang Nguyen, Dr. Cham Ho, Reverend Tâm Hữu Phạm, Mr. Chuk Ho, and countless others, we were able to bring about some changes, but change has been slow. Severe human rights abuses continue in Vietnam, and data suggests these abuses are mounting. Mr. Chairman, the principles of religious freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom to organize, and the freedom to own property have served as the bedrock of our great nation for over 2 centuries. Not only do we defend our citizens against those internal forces that seek to suppress these freedoms, we fought and have given our lives to defend these freedoms against foreign nations that threaten to destroy these values. We have demanded of ourselves that these freedoms must be preserved at all costs, and we demand the same from those nations with whom we associate. In the case of Vietnam, the U.S. Congress has repeatedly required that the Vietnamese government adhere to universal standards on human rights for decades, but little has been achieved. The Vietnamese government in 2017 committed what is regarded as an outright assault on freedom and universal human rights. Instead of using the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, which was held in Vietnam, to demonstrate its adherence to universal standards on human rights, the government amplified human rights abuses, including against freedom or religion or belief. According to the USCIRF, the assault on the freedom of religion, expression, association, and assembly was nationwide, signifying a concerted effort to suppress and silence critics and peaceful activists. Vietnam systematically harassed, arrested, imprisoned, and tortured dissidents, democracy activists, bloggers, and religious leaders on an unprecedented scale not since the end of the Vietnam War. Thus, the Vietnamese government's previous willingness to engage in dialogue on issues of human rights and religious freedom was only a ruse to gain benefits. And after the benefits have been gained, it reverts back to its old ways. But Vietnam has gotten smarter. To be able to wash their hands of the crimes committed against those who love freedom, they conspire with thugs and criminals to silence dissent. One group of such thugs is the Red Flag Association, a militant pro-government mob aimed at harassing Catholics. As a Catholic myself, I find this particularly distasteful. The Red Flag Association's goal is to suppress and hamper protests against the Formosa steel plant, whose illegal toxic dumping caused one of the greatest environmental disasters in Vietnam and brought suffering to the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who depended on the rivers and seas for their livelihood. Moreover, they sow division between Catholics and non-Catholics, intimidate parishioners, vilify priests, attack lay leaders, and desecrate churches and homes. The association's membership consists of local security forces, government employees, members of government-sponsored organizations, unemployed adults, and street thugs. The Red Flag leaders, among others, consist of Trần Nhật Quang, Lê Thị Quỳnh Hoan, Nguyễn Trọng Nghĩa. According to the USCIRF, the harassment and assaults carried out by the Red Flag Association were government-directed or government-tolerated. An egregious incident involving the Red Flag Association occurred recently in Nghệ An province. On December 23, 2017, a group of thugs belonging to the association went to Nghệ Gai Parish and harassed, intimidated, and assaulted the parishioners while they were working on an irrigation project on their land near the church. A criminal complaint was filed with the Nghệ An police against the perpetrators. Instead of arresting the thugs, Nghệ An Province Police prosecuted the victims and or witnesses of the criminal incident. Groups belonging to the Red Flag Association also carry out acts of harassment and violence in Song Ngọc, Văn Thái, and Yom Kieu parishes in Nghệ An Province. Acts were also carried out in Vinh Diocese in central Vietnam and Tho Hoa Parish in Dong Nai Province. However, these actions are only the tip of an iceberg. Government-sanctioned land grab against religious institutions continues unabated for personal profit and economic gains of corrupt officials. One example is Tu Tim Convent, belonging to a congregation of Catholic nuns who on May 1st, 2018, received a notice from the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City requiring that the church be moved or face confiscation because the church is located on a block of land illegally auctioned to a developer who intends to convert the land into a marketplace. Furthermore, how ironic that the APEC summit attended by President Trump in November of 2017 was held at a resort in Da Nang City, owned by the very developer that took over the land illegally seized with the use of harassment, detention, and torture from Gonyo Parish, an incident that I and Chairman Smith condemned but was unable to prevent as we looked on helplessly. However, we are no longer helpless. The passage of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights and Accountability Act, which President Obama signed into law on December 23, 2016, now enables this House to bring justice to the victims of Gonyo Parish. Pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Human Rights and Accountability Act, I would like to submit the following officials who were involved in the illegal land grab of Gonyo Parish for sanctions. And for the sake of brevity, I just simply mention their names. First is Nguyễn Bá Thanh, Trần Văn Minh, Văn Hữu Chiến, Võ Văn Thương, Lê Quang Nam, Nguyễn Văn Tiến, Lê Văn Tâm, Trần Mữu, Huỳnh Đức Thọ, Nguyễn Điều, Nguyễn Văn Toàn, Lê Việt Lâm, Hồ Thị Nga, Lê Việt Hiếu, Phan Hữu Phụng, Đặng Hồng Phúc, Nguyễn Ngọc Tuấn. The incidents enumerated above is but a fraction of the abuses that the Vietnamese government has inflicted on its own people the past years. USCRIF Annual Report 2018 Vietnam chapter outlines numerous accounts of other acts which I will not enumerate here. And Dr. Thang Nguyen will direct this subcommittee's attention to Vietnam's law on belief and religion implemented in January of this year, which could open the door to further oppression and restriction on the freedom of religion. I commend President Trump in his meeting with Prime Minister Xuân Hữu Phúc on May 31st, 2017, which stressed the importance of protecting and promoting human rights in Vietnam. However, I believe more must be done. In agreement with the USCIRF, I suggest 1. Vietnam be redesignated as a country of particular concern. 2. Economic and trade negotiations must address human rights and religious freedom abuses in Vietnam. 3. Vietnam must be required to provide concrete benchmarks in the promotion of human rights and religious freedom. 4. Vietnam promptly release prisoners of conscience and democracy activists who were arrested and imprisoned under dubious laws. 5. Return and/or adequately compensate victims of illegal land grab. 6. A transparent system of compensation for the victims of the Formosa environmental disaster be implemented. And 7. The passage of the Vietnam Human Rights Act. In closing, I would like to once again thank Chairman Smith and members of the subcommittee for holding this important hearing. In due respect, I would like to direct the subcommittee's attention to the words of Queen Rania Al Abdullah of Jordan. When you deprive people their rights to live in dignity, to hope for a better future, to have control over their lives, when you deprive them of that choice, then you expect them to fight for these rights. Staying faithful to the principles that make our nation great, we will fight for the rights of those who do not have a voice. We ask that this House and this administration will heed the voice of the oppressed around the world, particularly those of the people of Vietnam. Thank you very much.
Congressman Gao, thank you very much for your eloquent statement and again for your leadership. Dr. Tong.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for using this timely hearing to shine a spotlight on the worsening human rights conditions in Vietnam. And also thank you for bringing us together, because this is an opportunity for me to see Diana per camera after 25 years. Diana used to work with us, collaborate with us on projects to push back forced repatriation of Vietnamese boat people in Hong Kong. Since late 2016, we have documented a surge in the number of prisoners of conscience and the government's more aggressive drive to force members of unregistered churches to renounce their faith or to convert to government-created or controlled religions. We have documented so far some 170 prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. I should have added 4 more. These are Falun Gong members who just got sentenced to 3 years of prison recently. And 1/3 of those prisoners of conscience on our list are actually religious prisoners. In the first 5 months of this year, 23 human rights advocates have been sentenced to a total of 172 years in prison, followed by 41 years of house arrest. And among them, 4 members of the same Hoa Hao Buddhist family are serving a total of 17 years of imprisonment. The ongoing brutal persecution of Hoa Hao Buddhists is documented in a report by the Hoa Hao Buddhist Congregation Central Overseas Executive Committee, which, with your permission, I would like to include as part of this testimony. The government of Vietnam has stepped up its game in forcing followers of independent, unregistered churches to renounce their faith. Forced renunciation of faith has caused the membership of the Montagnard Evangelical Church of Christ, which was founded by former prisoner of conscience, Pastor Nguyễn Công Chính, that was mentioned by Mr. Lowenthal just now, to plummet from its high of 1,500 members just 18 months ago to merely 500 today. And at least 1,100 families of Hmong Christians in North and Central Vietnam have been denied citizenship documents and evicted from their villages because they refused to abandon their Christian faith. The circumstances are described in detail in a report by Hmong United for Justice, which, with your permission, again, I would like to include as part of my testimony. Registration requirements is the government's most potent instrument to force members of unregistered churches to abandon their faith and or join government-created or controlled churches. The growth of the latter spells the decline and demise of independent religions, but is often mistaken as a sign of improved religious freedom in Vietnam. One prime example is the massive forced conversion of millions of Cao Dai followers, which has gone unnoticed by the international community for the past 2 decades. In 1978, the Vietnamese government sweepingly abolished the Cao Dai Church altogether. Then in 1997, by a directive of the Communist Party, the government created a totally new sect which repudiates the most fundamental dogma of Cao Dai religion, and that is direct communion between the Supreme Being and humanity through Spiritism. For ease of reference, I will call this newly created government-created sect the 1997 sect, the year it was formed. With government support, it has occupied the Holy See of the Cao Dai religion in Tây Ninh province and has barred Cao Dai followers, true Cao Dai followers, from accessing it. In 2008, for instance, the Vietnamese public security issued an arrest warrant against Mr. Dương Xuân Lương, and he was here in Congress to talk to some of you members of Congress, because he was suspected of organizing a gathering on the grounds of the Holy See. He had to be on the run for 8 years before he successfully escaped to Thailand, and he came to this country last year. A more recent gathering in 2015 of 200 Cao Dai followers at their own Holy See was met with violence by the police and the security unit of the 1997 sect. This sect has systematically seized Cao Dai temples throughout the country, often using force and violence with support of the police and thugs. For more than 8 years, for instance, Cao Dai followers in Saigon had to conduct prayer services on the pavement outside of their temple after it had been taken by force by the government-created sect. In 2012, as another example, members of the 1997 sect, with the support of government officials and thugs, seized the Cao Dai temple in Phu My, Bình Định province, by force. The local leader of that sect poured gasoline on a young Cao Dai follower and was about to set him on fire when other sect members stopped him. Of the hundreds of Cao Dai temples, all except 15 have been seized by the government-created sect. To coerce Cao Dai followers to convert, the 1997 sect has routinely disrupted religious activities conducted in private homes. On November 11th of 2015, its members, accompanied by the public security police and thugs, entered the home of a female Cao Dai follower in Tây Ninh province, broke off the ongoing religious ceremony, and trashed food being served to guests because she had not asked the 1997 sect for its blessing. We have documented some 20 similar incidents in different cities and provinces so far. Less than 5 months ago, earlier this year, the 1997 sect blocked the burial of a 78-year-old Cao Dai follower because his mourning family members had invited clergy members of the real Cao Dai religion to the funeral. And just last week, we received reports that many tombs of Cao Dai followers being desecrated by the 1997 sect. The government-created sect is different from the Cao Dai religion in all aspects: dogma, name, charter, canonical law, organizational structure. Yet it occupies the Holy See and uses the letterhead, the seal, the insignias of the Cao Dai religion in all its communications and publications. Foreign governments, including our own government, have thus mistaken it for the Cao Dai religion and misinterpreted its activities as greater religious freedom for Cao Dai followers. This is analogous to a sect that does not recognize Christ as the Son of God, occupies the Vatican, persecutes Catholics, and yet presents itself as the Catholic Church. And the international community has been fooled. The new law on belief and religion has even more stringent registration requirements and will give local authorities even more power to curtail unregistered independent religions, which represent the vast majority of people of faith in Vietnam. 3 weeks ago, the government of Liên Trạch Commune in Quảng Trị province officially declared that under the new law, it is now illegal for the local parish priest to conduct prayer services in the private homes of his parishioners. In the case of Cao Dai religion, the new law will certainly further tip the balance in the favor of the impostor. In light of the above, I recommend that the U.S. government, again echoing the recommendation of Congressman Cao, redesignate Vietnam as a country of particular concern, or at least place Vietnam on the International Religious Freedom Watch List. Apply sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act and the International Religious Freedom Act against not only government officials, but also non-state actors, such as the Red Flag Associations or the 1997 sect that pretends to be the Cao Dai religion, found to be responsible for gross human rights violations. Press Vietnam to immediately and unconditionally release all prisoners of conscience and amend its laws, including the law on belief and religion, to be in compliance with all human rights treaties that Vietnam is a state party of. Work with like-minded governments to raise serious concerns on human rights issues at the Universal Periodic Review of Vietnam to be held in January of next year. And finally, engage directly with the unregistered churches through regular roundtable meetings with their relatives, representatives, their leaders, both in Vietnam and in the United States. Thank you.
I'd like to, I'm Congressman Rohrabacher and Chairman Smith. We'll be back, and I'm very honored to chair this hearing while he's gone. And let me say hello to my old friend, as well as new friends, and just say that I personally appreciate what you're doing here today. You have listed for us the heroes, and you're listing for us the villains. And we have news for the heroes, which is you are not forgotten. You may languish away, you may be just suppressed as the Cao Dai and our Mountain Yard friends are, or there's others there who are the villains. To the heroes we say, you are not forgotten. The Vietnamese people who are standing tall during these bad times, you are not forgotten, you are not alone. And to the villains that torture them and conduct themselves in an oppressive way toward their own people, we say, we're going to get you. We're coming for you. The people who believe in freedom in this world will not forget the crimes that you are committed against your own people right now. So thank you for being specific on what people are being actually oppressed and vilified, and they're being treated and tortured, mistreated and tortured, and their rights are being taken away, specifically, which you both have. And thanks for naming the villains as well, so that we can hold them accountable. Like I say, I didn't agree with the title of the Magnitsky Act, but I believe I vote the actual substance of that act of holding people accountable is a major step forward for the United States. And now we will have Ms. Pro Kemper. Go right ahead.
There we go. I'm truly honored to be here to testify before you, because the last time I presented testimony to Congress on Vietnam was around the time of normalization. And Dr. Tong, I remember working with you in the camps in Hong Kong. I followed Vietnam for years as the researcher on Vietnam for Human Rights Watch. And my heart is heavy because I'm sad to observe that the progress in human rights we had hoped that closer relations might bring has not been realized. To the contrary, we see a sharp decline in the very recent years. As everyone at this hearing has made clear, human rights in Vietnam are deeply restricted in almost every area, and it has not changed significantly in nearly the quarter century in which I followed the country. The Communist Party of Vietnam continues to maintain a monopoly on political power, suppresses every conceivable challenge to its authority or prestige, and it equates its self-preservation with national security. All basic rights, including freedom of speech, opinion, press, association, and religion, are conditioned on the supremacy of the party and accordingly restricted. Those who try to assert their rights against authority, promote rights awareness, or write or speak about human rights in any medium face harassment, intimidation, physical assault, and imprisonment. These are the facts. Repression is not strictly partisan or ideological. Criticism of the status quo is enough to bring retribution. Farmers continue to lose land to development projects without adequate compensation. Workers are not allowed to form independent unions. The entire system of enforcement serves the interests of those in power. The courts are not independent. Police use torture and beatings to extract confessions. Plainclothes thugs are deployed to harm and intimidate people when arrest or more formal confrontation is deemed inconvenient. Once detained, people may be further physically tortured, ill-treated, denied family visits, adequate food, or needed medical care. This is all well known. It has been known for decades. Despite this, increasing numbers of bloggers and activists have called publicly for democracy and greater freedoms, but Vietnam is not letting them speak. In recent years, the government has arrested and criminally prosecuted an increasing number of people for simply saying things critical of the government. In 2017, we know police arrested at least 41 people by our count for sweeping national security offenses that are used to punish critical speech, peaceful activism. In the first 5 months of this year, the courts convicted at least 26 people for political offenses. Although it's always difficult to get reliable figures, our impression is the trend in numbers of people being arrested and convicted have been increasing, and the harshness of sentences meted out has increased as well. And there's no sign of change or progress. To the contrary, Vietnam's legislature is scheduled to pass a cybersecurity law on June 12th that will provide yet another way people who criticize the government or the party can be silenced and punished. And it's going to be enlisting local and foreign companies in this suppression. We're about to publish a press release on this topic. I'll give you a little preview. This law will give the Ministry of Public Security the power to command the erasure of all kinds of forbidden content. Forbidden content in Vietnam can be anything that is simply disfavored by the government. It will force companies to verify the real names of users, keep those names localized in Vietnam, and produce them to public security on demand, and then to force companies to deny services to those who post what the government, that is the Ministry of Public Security, considers forbidden content. It will make also accessing information that is behind a firewall via a VPN a crime. This is one of the more repressive cybersecurity laws we've seen. We think it's something that Congress must take note of. Mr. Chairman and, Representative Rohrabacher, members, our chief recommendation to the committee and to the U.S. government in general is to speak much more forcefully and publicly to the government of Vietnam about the problems and use the whole of the U.S. government to do so. Every congressional office, every federal agency that engages with Vietnam, and whether it's on trade, military assistance, hardware and software transfers, education, or any other subject, should be expressing deep concern on human rights to its counterparts. They should be saying, in this kind of frank language, we see what you're doing, and it's tremendously disappointing to us. The fact that your government continues to beat, detain, incarcerate people for dissent or religious conviction more than 2 decades since the normalization of relations is a constant source of injury to this relationship between our country and yours. Your actions imperil our security and economic relationship, a problem which in the context of an increasingly dominant China is not a good thing for you, and it's not a good thing for us. Congress should be sending delegations to Vietnam who can speak these concerns face to face. We also recommend that you list key cases of concern you'd like to see resolved. Tell them that you know who they are detaining. Tell them about Nguyen Van Dai. Tell them about Chan Huy Dien Tuk, a 51-year-old entrepreneur who's serving 16 years in prison for calling for democracy and a multi-party political system. Why don't you inquire about Nguyen Ngoc Nhuy Quinn, also known as Mother Mushroom, a woman who is sentenced to 10 years in prison for advocating social and political issues such as land confiscation, displacement of communities, police brutality, freedom of expression. Hoang Duc Beng, 34, a very young man sentenced to 14 years in prison for his activism to promote the rights of workers and fishermen in the context of that disastrous 2016 Formosa toxic spill. We would also suggest you raise the case of Ngo Hao, a 70-year-old human rights and democracy activist currently serving a 15-year sentence after writing articles calling for transition to democracy in Vietnam. According to his family, he's suffering from poor health, including high blood pressure, gastric ulcers, high cholesterol. We ask that you raise these very specific cases because pressure on specific cases we know leads authorities to speed parole or improve conditions for prisoners. I have heard this directly from released prisoners. Your words, your actions directly affect their lives. In fact, they have, even if it fails to make an immediate improvement, they will hear about it. It will provide them comfort on a psychological level. It's a good deed to do. It's easy. We also suggest that should the National Assembly enact the cybersecurity law that I just described to you in detail, that will make online dissent even more dangerous, and enlist the complicity of U.S. corporations in Vietnamese repression, that you react and react very strongly in protest. Vietnam's actions of this nature should influence how Congress views its role in keeping U.S. technology and industry from being used for the purpose of stifling rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of opinion, and freedom of conscience are values that are central to this country, to its people, to its democracy, its security, and therefore to its foreign relations. Attached with my written testimony is a list of 140 prisoners detained for merely exercising their rights who are currently known to Human Rights Watch. Each and every one of them deserves your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. I'd like to now go to Anthony Lee.
Thank you very much. Dear member of the United States Congress, guests, and media organization who is concerned to Vietnamese human rights in Vietnam. My name is Lê Thanh Tùng. I'm a member of Brotherhood for Democracy. I'm just come from Vietnam. I'm here today to speak the ongoing crackdown by Vietnamese authority to Brotherhood for Democracy member over the past 5 years. Brotherhood for Democracy established in April 2013. There was a need for democratic society and sustainable development in Vietnam. Today we have more over than 100 members across regions in Vietnam and some from around the world. Our goal is to promote democracy in Vietnam, develop civil society, and disseminate universal declaration of human rights, and support to other civil society in the various projects. Our previous goals include the launch of Brotherhood for Democracy, met the need of who want to promote human rights and democracy in Vietnam. There's the value of many Vietnamese, and since the founding of the Brotherhood for Democracy, 100 people have joined to our organization, which we have 32 members work full-time and part-time. Over 4 years, we have established the solid structure and various working groups of organized. We have organized 16 training courses, both online and offline, and we have over 250 candidates join to learn. And face-to-face training involves over 100 people who concerned to the situation of Vietnam human rights. We also support the worker on demands of labor rights, and we support the fishermen to demand for the environmental justice and lawful against the issue of the Formosa following the environmental. They left tons of toxins and fish washing assaults across 6 provinces in the center of Vietnam in 2016. We support to the land right petitioner and victim of garment of land grab. And of course, we got ongoing harassment from the Vietnamese authority. Given that Vietnam is only one party state, the Communist parties of Vietnamese do not allow civil society groups to operate without their knowledge or supervision. Because of this, it is necessary for Vietnamese authority to stop the activities of various civil society groups. This had happened to Brotherhood for Democracy, so that our organization has been harassed from the very beginning. From May 2014, 3 members of us, Nguyễn Nam Trung, Phạm Minh Vũ, and Nguyễn Thị Phương Anh, were arrested for attending the protest organized by workers in Bình Dương province. And November 2014, our worthy brother, Mr. Trương Minh Đức, and other members will be physically attacked with severe injury after supporting workers demanding for labor rights in Bình Dương province. And 6 December 2015, our member Mr. Nguyễn Văn Đài and Lý Quang Sơn were attacked and beaten after facilitating training on the Human Rights Declaration in Nghệ An province. And 16 December 2015, Nguyễn Văn Đài and Lê Thị Thu Hà were arrested by the authority. And October 2016, a member of us in the center of Vietnam, including Nguyễn Trung Trực, Mai Văn Tám, Trần Thị Xuân, Nguyễn Văn Thành, Nguyễn Ngọc Lành, Nguyễn Văn Giáp, Võ Thế Trương, và Quế, were detained and service beaten, has their possession confiscated and clothes removed before they have been bring to put in the jungle in Hương Sơn, Hà Tĩnh province. And February 2017, our chairman, Pastor Nguyễn Trung Tôn, was assaulted, beaten around the feet with an iron bar, until now still unable to walk properly. From the end July of 2017, 7 members of Earth and 1 former member, Phạm Văn Trội, Nguyễn Trung Tôn, Trương Minh Đức, Nguyễn Trung Trực, Trần Thị Xuân, Nguyễn Văn Túc, Vũ Văn Hùng, and Nguyễn Bắc Truyến were arbitrarily arrested. 9 members and 1 former member of the Brotherhood for Democracy were unlawfully detained between December 2015 and the end 2017 for activities aimed at overthrowing the state, according to the Article 79 of the Vietnamese Penal Code. Many have been sentenced to lengthy prison term, and our remaining members are all being threatened and issued arrest warrant with ongoing harassment of family members. 6 members of Earth have to flee to Thailand to seek for asylum. Some members of Earth have to far from home for about 5 years, with their close one being continuing harassed by the authority. And for myself, personally, I have to far from home from August 2015 till now. I'm lucky here and have safety in the United States, but my wife and children continue to be harassed. My wife has been attacked by local police within the confines of her home, and my children have to be detained while traveling to school to question them about me. Police have installed 5 cameras around my house in Saigon, and who approached to my home is questioned immediately after. No one has come to my house for over the past 2 years. On behalf of the Brotherhood for Democracy, I would like to suggest the following. The United States Congress and the government call on the Vietnamese government to end its crackdown on the Brotherhood for Democracy and unconditionally and immediately release all of our members as well as prisoners of conscience, dissident, and religion activists. Call on authority to stop harassing and intimidating Vietnamese activists. We hope the United Nations and various NGO, media, and individual Vietnam and around the world to support to the Brotherhood for Democracy as well as the democracy movement in Vietnam. Members of the Brotherhood for Democracy as well as their family express their ongoing struggle and hope there will be a brighter future for the Brotherhood for Democracy as well as for all Vietnamese people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. He does have to leave. Chairman Rohrabacher?
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm going to have to rush off a very important call. It's really important, but I wanted to express my thanks to the witnesses, thanks to the chairman. You've done a great service to the free people of the world today. You have put on the record names of people who have been oppressed and tortured, and now there is a record, official record of these people. The message we will have at the end of this hearing to those who are the oppressed, to those who are the victims, they are not alone. The victims of tyranny in Vietnam are not alone. We are with them. We are on the record now of knowing who you are. And that's true, as I mentioned before, that's true of their torturers and the villains that murder and repress those people. We need those names. You've given us a few of those as well, because we do believe in holding accountable the tyrants in this world. And Mr. Chairman, we need to hold accountable YouTube and Facebook and other American companies, as has been talked about today, who collude, people like to use that word nowadays, who collude with this tyrannical gangster regime in Vietnam. I spent a little time with the Montagnards back in 1967, and it breaks my heart to know that that they found Christianity and that they're being oppressed because of it. And I know that the Cao Dai, I remember them as well, who were so devout even in those days. So perhaps one of the things we need to feel bad about in America is when we were there, When I was with those Montagnards, we encouraged them to side with us, and then we ran away. Well, now we can make it up to the Vietnamese people to make sure that now, as Vietnam needs us in their confrontation with China as a nation, that we insist that there be political reform and social reform there, and that the gangster regime gives up the power to the people of Vietnam. So we're siding with the people, as we should have always along, and had courage to do so. Thank you all for your testimony today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for all the commitment you've shown to human rights throughout the world, especially here in Vietnam. So thank you.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you for your leadership as well. It's all about team effort. Let me just ask our distinguished panelists some questions, and thank you all for your testimonies. Without objection, anything else you wanted added, the full statements, and thank you for the list of prisoners from Human Rights Watch. We need names, always need names. Compare it with others to make sure we do not leave anybody out inadvertently, so thank you for that. Let me just ask you, if I could, Dr. Tong, starting with you, on religious freedom. The designation of CPC, country of particular concern, was done away with during the Bush administration, simply because of the bilateral agreement and promises that were made of what they called deliverables at the time on human rights. I traveled, as you might recall, one of many trips to Vietnam. I went to Hue, Ho Chi Minh City, and Saigon, and Hanoi, and met with probably upwards of 60 different people, all the different religions, all the, Venerable Taekwondo, like so many of my colleagues and I have met, who's still under pagoda arrest, and Father Lee, Father Loy, all these wonderful, wonderful people, Cao Dai religion adherents. And they were hopeful. They thought that maybe something was going to happen for real. There were new policies in effect, and yet it was a total unmitigated disaster. And we now have a new law that went into effect in January, and I think some of the same people are saying, oh, this could be a positive development, will be sorely disappointed by it, and you might want to speak to that issue. You really did emphasize, and I'm glad you did, that Cao Dai has been eviscerated by the government. The forced renunciations of faith by the Hmong and others, the Highland people, who are being told they can't practice their Christian beliefs. The numbers went down right before bilateral trade agreement was accepted, but I'll never forget the day of the consummation of that agreement. The Vietnamese Foreign Ministry put out a statement to the effect of there's no linkage to human rights. So they did everything they could to make it look like we are on the verge of major positive developments, and it was nothing but a ruse. And I think there's too often, so if you could speak to CBC, I would also raise the issue when Wing Sheng Phuc, the president, was here in May. The communique that came out was very disturbing between him and President Trump. To the effect that the U.S. welcomed Vietnam's, quote, ongoing efforts to refine its legal system to better protect and promote human rights. In the face of a gross deterioration of human rights, they can pass all the policies for international consumption that they want, but we want it on the ground to help people and to protect their fundamental rights. So how did that happen? Any of you might have any insights on that. I would note for the record, I mentioned it in my opening statement, that for 3 successive Congresses and then once as an amendment, so 4 times, the Vietnam Human Rights Act cleared the House. It was my bill. We worked very hard on it, totally bipartisan. Everybody was here today. Zoe Lofgren, everybody. We're all co-sponsors, so it was totally bipartisan. Got over to the Senate, holds were put on it. John Kerry always put a hold on it. But we know the Podesta group worked overtime to defeat it. And we know there are other lobbyists who are trying to defeat it. I'm wondering if maybe even that joint communique, Reuters suggested in an article that they had, lobbyists had an impact on what that joint communique from our president and Vietnam's president was, which was totally misleading. So if you want to speak to that, then I would also ask, if I could, Ms. Kempner, on that cyber law, June 12th, I think, is when the vote might be. That could always change, but I think that's when they're planning on it. Back in 2006, I held a hearing as China Commission and Human Rights Chairman here on the House side, on what Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, and Cisco were doing to enable the dictatorship in Beijing by censoring, by tracking down individuals. Shurtao, remember, they found him via Yahoo, and he got 10 years for telling people what Tiananmen Square do's and don'ts were, and they're all don'ts coming from the government. 10 years for a simple conveyance of a message to a human rights group in New York City. I'm very concerned, and I know you are as well, that Google, Facebook, YouTube have all removed content kowtowing to Hanoi. We need to be, as you said too, as loud and as clear as possible that these U.S. corporations and multilateral corporations have to get some backbone and stand up to these dictatorships. I remember Jerry Yang said, Yang from Yahoo, at one of our hearings that he said they were moving their content in Vietnam of personally identifiable information so that the government would have that easy access that they have had for years in China. But this is very, very disturbing. Google, Facebook, YouTube, and the like. So it's like deja vu all over again. It's been banned in Vietnam. It's been worse in China. But now we're seeing catch-up ball on the part of the Vietnamese. So if you could start off, and then I have some other questions as well. Maybe Dr. Tong and
Yes,
Joseph, if you'd like to.
We sounded the alarm about the new law on belief and religion when it was still being drafted back in 2015. And we pointed out 3 areas of concern. One is that it still maintains the requirement for churches and institutions and communities to register and be recognized and approved by the government. Secondly, the language is so vague that anyone can interpret it whichever way he or she wants, right? Just like in the example that I mentioned in my testimony, a local authority said that, well, from now on, the parish priest can no longer conduct prayer service at the private home of his parishioners. And he cited the new law. The local authorities recited the new law to justify that. The third area of concern is that the definition of what religion is, what belief is, what an adherent is, are very restrictive. For instance, the definition under the new law of an adherent is that he or she must be recognized by a religious organization. And a religious organization must be recognized by the government. In other words, now a follower, a member of an independent, unregistered church would not be considered as a religious follower under the new law. And therefore, sentencing that person to, say, 5 years prison would now be explained as not religious persecution. So that is the trick that Vietnamese government is playing. And I'm afraid that we have fallen into that trap. Now, not too long ago, I had a one-on-one, hour-long meeting with the new ambassador to Vietnam, Brink. He's very concerned about human rights issues in Vietnam, very genuine, but he's very new. And I also had meetings with the new ambassador at large on international religious freedom, Sam Brownback. He's a champion. And I made 2 recommendations to both. One is to place Vietnam at least on the watch list. At this time, because this is a very critical time, as Vietnam is still deciding on how to interpret its law on belief and religion. If we wait for another year, it might be too late, because they already have redefined all the language intentionally left vague, so as to further restrict religious freedom. So placing Vietnam on the watch list now for at least 2 years, that will send a very strong signal that we are watching. That hasn't happened. Hopefully after a few months for these 2 diplomats to get to know more about Vietnam, maybe with some nudges from Congress, maybe Vietnam would be placed on either the CPC list or the watch list. The second recommendation is that for Mr. Brink and also Sam Brownback and others to hold periodic roundtable meetings with religious leaders of persecuted communities in Vietnam, indigenous and religious communities in Vietnam, just like the Earth Roundtable that have been being held here, and I know that Scott Flipsy has attended quite a few of them. And make that into routine. Initially, the government of Vietnam would protest against that, would block people from coming, but if we keep doing that every 3 months, for instance, then slowly Vietnam would accept that as a fait accompli. And that would bring confidence to those communities, and it will assure that anything happening to those communities will be known by the US government immediately, or at least by the next roundtable meeting. So those are my 2 recommendations, and I would like to offer the same recommendations at this hearing.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to add that, both you and I, we fully understand that the concept of religion and religious faith is more than simply going to church every Sunday and then go home. We fully understand that the practice of faith, which includes fighting for social justice, advocating for the oppressed, for the poor, for the elderly, all of that is encompassed in religious faith. And with the law on religion and belief, with the vagueness of how they define religion, any of these acts can be considered as acts against the state and be prosecuted. So again, that is something that we have to be concerned about and you have to pay attention to. And there is an old saying that with the communists, do not listen to what they say, but watch what they do. What they say is very rosy, oftentimes painted. When you look at Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi through the Travel Channel, everybody thinks that, wow, these are paradise that we should go and visit. But in reality, Vietnam is an oppressed state. People are being routinely arrested, prosecuted under dubious laws, tortured routinely, and that has to be revealed to the world, to let people understand that Vietnam is more than simply Saigon and Ho Chi Minh City through the Travel Channel.
Ms. Bokemper.
Just to add, because I am a law professor, I wanted to point out to you that freedom of opinion and belief are among the very strongest human rights that exist. They don't admit of any limitation at all. And so when we learn that things like forced renunciation of faith is still occurring, this is a violation without any conceivable excuse, and we should be reacting very strongly to it. On the law, I think you're right to pay special attention to this. This is one of the most oppressive cybersecurity laws I've read, and I've read quite a few now. And it puts companies in a tremendous bind. As you know, any company is obliged to respect the law of the market it operates in. But in this case, it's going to make many American companies have this direct conflict that they could be placed right back where Google and Microsoft were in China, as you observed, and be forced to essentially condemn people who would be fully protected under either the laws of our Constitution or the laws of the United Nations that Vietnam has freely agreed to, and condemn them. And it's going to be essentially a move that puts to them the stark choice. Either help us commit human rights violations or get out of this market. And if that's indeed the choice, and if the Congress cares about U.S. companies as well as human rights, it ought to be thinking, well, what does this mean for our giving access to Vietnam on a whole, to our markets to Vietnam? What does this really mean about international security and the freedom of companies to operate across borders? So they're very profound questions for regulators here. And they're not only about blaming the companies. The companies, will have to make their decisions, but they're in a difficult position. It's people who control the law and the regulation throughout our government. We deeply appreciate your role, Mr. Chairman. I deeply appreciate the many constructive things that Representative Rohrabacher and many others have done throughout the years. I resonate with pain on these tales of Montagnards. I work to actually identify and protect Montagnards from repatriation in Hong Kong. There's a long and very noble history of this House in trying to act on Vietnam's human rights, but we need the whole of government. We need the entire administration. We need the Senate too. And everyone has to pull together to send this message. In our experience, the Vietnamese government is pragmatic. When it feels it has something to lose, it will act. And in our experience, the Vietnamese government is complex, just like most governments. It has people who are very entrenched in the old ways, people who are thinking about new ways and trying to be progressive and keep the door open to the modern world. So you have to deal with it and give it time to adjust, but it won't happen without incentives. So we raised a number of different avenues that they all have to be considered. We're there to support you.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, if you could. We know about the Formosa environmental disaster, but if you could bring some additional focus on it. How did you become an advocate? What the background of the Brotherhood of Democracy, a little insight into that if you would. And also to make very clear, we're concerned, I'm concerned as chairman for your family still in Vietnam. And your wife and child, if they are threatened or in any way. In the past, we have had, Win Van Dy's wife was here and testified on his behalf, was brilliant in her, like our witnesses today, just got it very clear, very precise, and very eloquent as to what needs to be done and what the situation is on the ground. And he is in the process of, on his way to freedom right now, but can't announce it yet. But I just want to say, we want to know, give you every assurance that we will absolutely go to bat for your family if we hear that something has happened. So please know that it matters a great deal to my colleagues and I on both sides of the aisle, and let the Vietnamese government take note of that, because that crosses a huge bright line of demarcation if they were to retaliate against them. But could you elaborate, if you could, on the environmental disaster?
Yeah, for the Formosa issue, from April 2016, is the Formosa community waste toxic to environmental, and the Formosa they also pay 500 million for the people at there, but actually our fishermen there, we don't receive any money from the compensation from the Formosa. And the compensation, it comes to another group of people. And we know that, and we organize a team to come to the fishermen, come to the village to help the people to make documents, to make the legal documentation, submit to the local authority to ask for the compensation from the Formosa. That's the first thing we have to do. Secondly, is we cooperate with other NGO as well as some civil society in local to organize some work group to help the people, and as well as we are together. Because the people, we are together to support to the people at there to make the news and to bring the things to the public, to media, to internet. That's it, the two things we have done for the issue of Formosa.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to add that the system of there's no transparent system of compensation. I recently spoke with a bishop from Vietnam, and he told me that they don't know what has been happening with the 500 million that was being allegedly paid by Formosa. Most of the victims have not received the money. Ironically, the fishermen of Nghệ An province, they were at the epicenter of the disaster. And based on my information and belief, those people were not even in the compensation package. So So again, I would ask that the Congress request that Vietnam implement a transparent system of compensation similar to what happened during the BP oil spill here in the United States. It was being controlled by and oversaw by a federal judge down in New Orleans. I would highly recommend that a similar system would be implemented in Vietnam with similar reporting procedures. If you would excuse me, I have to meet this deadline for a few minutes.
Yes, Dr. Tong.
I'd like to add information regarding the disaster caused by Formosa steel plants in 2016. First of all, we know that I have been in touch with communities in that area every week, and the fishing industry is dead. It may take decades to revive it. So there's a huge loss of livelihood among the fishermen, the fishing communities, and many of those are actually Catholic parishes living along the coast of 5 provinces. Now, one entire province, that is the most populous province that got affected severely by the environmental disaster, and that is Nghệ An province. It is completely excluded from the compensation package. And that's why there's a lot of protest, and that's why, and among all those affected, the Catholic parishes were at the forefront of the demonstration to demand fair, just compensation. And that's why the government created the Red Flag Association to suppress these communities, these advocates. The second aspect I'd like to bring to your attention is the health issue. We are documenting right now, and there are more and more reported incidents of miscarriage among the villages affected by the environmental ecological disaster, and there's more reported prevalence of cancer cases in those areas, and there has been no studies along that line. And finally, human trafficking. Because of the loss of livelihood, so a lot of these young villagers, formerly fishermen, now have to join the labor export program of the government of Vietnam. And we know cases where a person applying to go to Taiwan or to South Korea had to pay $16,000 in service fees. Now the law would cap that to just one month of salary per year of contract. Say $2,000 a month for 3 years of contract, then it should not exceed more than 3 years. So no more than $6,000. But a lot of these villagers, they didn't know the law, and they had to pay $16,000, and they had to mortgage off their homes, their farmlands, and the homes and farmlands of their parents, their siblings. And according to our calculation, most of them would still be in debt after the 3 years working overseas. And for the first time last year, the number of migrant workers exported out of countries exceeded 100,000 by far. It was like 120,000. So I'm afraid that human trafficking, labor trafficking is on the rise because government officials are taking advantage of the misery caused by the Formosa-induced disaster, environmental disaster.
Thank you very much for invitation, for inviting me here. So now I got a break news I just received around 2.5 hours ago. Here on behalf of Brotherhood for Democracy, I would like to deeply thank you very much for Mr. Smith, the chairman, and some Congress member here, and various NGO here have support to the Brotherhood for Democracy. 2.5 hours ago, our worthy brother and his wife and worthy sister was released, and now it's on the flight to Frankfurt, and hope they will arrive to Frankfurt around this midnight, the time of the Washington DC. His name is Nguyen Van Dai and Lê Thị Thu Hà, and his wife is also on the flight now. So thank you very much for your support and help brotherhood for during the time. Thank you very much.
Due to the time, I will just ask two final questions, and thank you very much. And I think, Dr. Tang, you are aware that I am the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I've been very concerned that for 6 straight years, Vietnam has got a Tier 2 rating. Minimally, it should be on the watch list, if not Tier 3, which I think where it belongs. They do have a sex trafficking problem, but I think the labor trafficking problem is enormous. And we've had specific hearings in this subcommittee just on that. And I'm wondering if any of you would want to speak to, the TIP report isn't out yet. Designations probably have been made already. We tried to weigh in as best we could as a subcommittee for countries that ought to be Tier 3. But if you could speak to that. And I would just point out that one other law that I wrote took 8 years to get out of the Senate, 5 times passed in the House, known as International Megan's Law. It's now been in effect for a little over a year. We notice countries of destination when a convicted pedophile is traveling. Its inspiration came from Megan Kanka, my hometown constituent, who was brutally murdered by a convicted and sexually abused by a convicted pedophile who lived across the street. So there are Megan's laws in every single state of the Union and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, but frankly, internationally, there's not many Megan's laws. This law, as I think you know, notices countries of destination when a convicted pedophile plans to travel. And there's a very severe penalty if they don't notice us being state police and then State Department. And the Angel Watch program now has been built and fully and very robustly staffed. And a little over a year in operation, 3,600 convicted pedophiles have been noticed to countries. Many of them have been turned back because we know why they're going. They're on secret sex tourism trips to exploit little girls and little boys. Well, Vietnam, as it turns out, is a destination country for many. We know other places like Thailand are working overtime to deny entry into their country when we notice them of such an exploiter coming their way. Vietnam has been unresponsive. We're trying to tell them, so-and-so is coming, here's their record, and they could abuse your children horribly, and yet they are unresponsive. And to me, it's an insight, like few others, about an indifference that is so callous towards their own children. Secondly, on the issue of, we just sadly remember the 29th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Much of the world seems to want to forget it. Certainly in China, they forcibly forget it in terms of their news media and what they teach their children in school. But there is a concern that with demonstrations against Chinese investments and incursions into the South China Sea or environmental disasters, that these people who will protest will be met with violence. And there's a very big anti-China demonstration planned for June 10th. And I'm wondering what your concerns might be and if there's anything we should be doing, our ambassador, to mitigate what could be bloodshed meted out by the Vietnamese government. Anybody who would want to take those?
Yes, about human trafficking. Yes, over the years we have rescued thousands of victims in destination countries. And we will continue to work on that, to rescue more victims. However, we cannot stop the flow if we don't do anything, if we cannot stop it at the roots, that is in the source country. And there's no way for us to go into Vietnam and stop it. However, there might be an opportunity here because of the Formosa-induced ecological disaster. I would like to propose that we, our governments, and through Congress, we ask USAID to have programs in those areas to help develop livelihood opportunities for these fishermen who have been affected, to have development projects, and work directly with the churches, independent churches, the Catholic churches that have been doing that. The Diocese of Vinh has been doing that. They don't ever get funded by USAID. Now, not too long ago, just last month, again, Ambassador Sam Brownback brought into the Earth Roundtable meeting representatives of the USAID offices. And I think that they are now willing and open to suggestions that the USAID should fund directly the independent religious organizations to do the good work that they have been doing. So USAID, if they are in there, they can work with and provide technical assistance and coaching to the real people doing the real work on the ground, especially the independent churches, to develop livelihood projects. At the same time, they can educate the people on the ground. There are simple tips that they can learn on how to avoid becoming victims of human trafficking, especially labor trafficking. For instance, you should not sign a contract without reading it. You should not agree to go overseas and work overseas on a tourist visa, for instance. There are simple red flags. And we have developed materials, but the challenge is to get those materials, that information, directly to the villagers that are vulnerable to human trafficking in Vietnam. Thank you.
I would simply urge that that when you look at this problem of trafficking human trafficking ought to be a topic on which you can constructively engage the government. The government of Vietnam does spend money and does have a bureaucracy that is devoted to this problem as well as related problems. But as you pointed out, it's not doing enough. But I think this is at least an area where cooperation and engagement is promising, as well as the application of American aid. I would urge you to look not only at victims of sexual trafficking, but labor trafficking generally. We are doing a lot of research on trafficking in the fishing industries, and I'm sure, as Dr. Tang knows, this is a big, big problem in Thailand, and a lot of the labor is coming from Burma and Vietnam. So there's a regional interest in getting a hold of this, and this is affecting American companies when they discover that they're marketing goods produced by slave labor. So I think this is a very promising area of engagement where, fortunately, economic interests and human rights interests align well.
I'll just conclude. Any further comments you might want to make, if you do? Oh, yes, Doctor.
Relating to the case of Nguyen Van Dai and his wife and his partner Lê Thu Hà, I would like to point out that collaboration with other governments might make a difference. I have noted that over the past year, there has been increasing collaboration between human rights officers at our U.S. Embassy in Vietnam and other embassies such as the United Kingdom, France, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, and EU, for instance.
In Germany?
And Germany, yes, in Germany, definitely. And in this case of Mr. Dai, our partner, most of the credit should go to VETO, V-E-T-O, exclamation mark, our long-term partner in Germany, and the government of Germany. They've been very strong on this. I know that they have been working with our own State Department on this case, and I hope that by more collaboration like that, especially you already know about the Interparliamentarian Panel on Freedom of Religion or Belief. We are working with them, and they are now connecting themselves, networking themselves with the ASEAN parliamentarians for human rights in ASEAN. So a network like that would really, really help to further many of our common causes. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you very, very much for your insights, for your expertise, your leadership, and for your patience, having been late starting because of the votes. You know, again, our bill that's pending, hopefully it'll be marked up soon. If ever there was a time, and it does call for designation of CPC, country of particular concern because of religious persecution by the government. I'll never forget talking to Rabbi Saperstein, who was the predecessor, obviously, to Sam Brownback as the ambassador at large for religious freedom. He did a wonderful job. But when he was meeting with Trans Lee Hung, she was beaten beaten. Government thugs beat the wife of a pastor, Win Kun Chin. I mean, if that isn't a wake-up call when the highest official for religious freedom in country, in Vietnam, and that's how they respond. It shows the animosity that continues to be animosity on steroids. So we have to push back hard, and I think, as you pointed out, Ms. Pro-Kempner, they take notice. When we say something, we mean it, it's predictable, we're not kidding, we're not vacillating, things will happen, and particularly when there's a penalty attached to it. So CPC has at least 18 prescribed remedies, penalties that are very significant. And I know when other countries have been put on lists like that, you know, they know we mean it, it has an impact. So let's hope the administration does the right thing on that. I thank you so much. Hearing's adjourned.